Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to call to order this meeting of the Planning and Development Council of the Town of Oakville. Madam Clerk, I understand we have regrets from Councillor Lischina and Councillor Duddick. And let's see, we also need to poll for declarations of pecuniary interest. Councillor Lapworth.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a declaration of pecuniary interest this evening as it affects items 1, 2, 3 and 4 in tonight's agenda, as one of my tax clients is an employee of ClubLink and he works at the Glen Abbey Golf Club.
Well, Council would be glad to excuse you then.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr.
Council, we need a mover and seconder to resolve in the committee of the whole. Councillor Hutchins and Councillor Robinson, all in favor? And that is carried. Now, we have no consent items. We have a public hearing to conduct on, I guess, 4 items here. So the very first thing we're going to do is turn our attention to Commissioner Closey, who will provide us an overview.
Mayor and members of council, as you know, have 4 reports on the agenda tonight, and they all relate to our cultural heritage landscape. I wanted to provide you first a bit of a background and a context for why we're here tonight, with really the last set of policy changes that we're looking at making to implement our cultural heritage landscape strategy. So in 2009, you'll see on the screen, we started the planning policy context for the cultural heritage landscape with policies in our Livable Oakville plan that you endorsed in 2009 in order to start and do a cultural heritage strategy so we could reflect the requirements that came out of the 2005 provincial policies. In 2014, actually January of 2014, you did approve a strategy which saw how we were going to go forward and implement the cultural heritage landscape. And in that strategy, there were about 63 properties that you identified that were identified as properties that we could consider at that point in time. So with the adoption of that strategy, we then went out and started a 3-phased implementation process. So phase 1 was actually in front of you in February of 2016. And what phase 1 did was it looked at all the 63 properties that were in the strategy. It also looked at some additional properties that were brought forward through that review. And it recommended how to proceed with each one of those properties, and it ranked them into a high, medium, and low priority ranking. With that information, then endorsed by Council in February 2016, we went forward and did the phase 2 portion of the implementation, which was to take the 8 properties that were identified as high priority and determine how we should go about protecting those, and so and to what level their significance was. So we brought back a report to you that looked at 6 of the properties in May of 2016. And in that report, we identified how to proceed with each one of those properties. And in particular, at that time, you identified the Glen Abbey site as a priority site for us to take forward towards implementation. You also identified at that time that Glen Abbey was a significant cultural heritage landscape and that we needed to proceed with that in that context. And this was all in a backdrop of the interim control bylaw that was in force as of February or the end of January of 2016. So in that context, this is one of those studies that needed to be completed in order to fulfill the requirements of the interim control bylaw, which you see on the screen was extended for an additional year in early of 2016, and it actually expires tomorrow. So on the the Ontario Heritage Act front, what we moved forward with, it was in August of 2017, a designation. So this is one of the tools then in terms of the phase 3 implementation for us to move forward with. We recommended a notice of intent to designate, in particular the Glen Abbey site, because it was a priority site you had us take forward. We endorsed so that notice had gone out. We had received an objection to that notice, and that was resolved in late 2017. So the bylaw you approved in, I think it was mid-December of 2017. So if I can just go back to the planning policies, in terms of the implementation, you had in September dealt with an overall official plan amendment that set out the context for cultural heritage landscapes and how we were going to move forward with those. That policy framework then reflected the provincial policy statements of 2014, as well as the growth plan requirements that were in the 2017 growth plan. So in September, you dealt with that official plan amendment. So what you have tonight are two main elements around the cultural heritage landscape and bylaws in order to implement them. You'll see a presentation on the planning policy that sets out the official plan, policies which are town-wide, but also specific to the Glen Abbey site. You'll see a zoning bylaw that reflects specifically the Glen Abbey site, and Leslie Gilwoods will be making that presentation as the first agenda on the item on the agenda. Following that, there are a series of bylaws that we need to implement the conservation plan. And the conservation plan is the element that allows us to conserve the cultural heritage values and attributes on that particular site of the Glen Abbey site. So that presentation was made by Dennis Perlin, and those are bylaws that are a conservation bylaw, a delegation bylaw. And then he'll do the presentation of item 2 and 3 together. And the final presentation will be Diane Childs on just the conservation plan and how that plan would be implemented in order to conserve the attributes on Glen Abbey. So that gives you a context of our agenda for tonight. With that, I'll turn over the presentation to Leslie Gilwoods.
Good evening, Mayor Burton, members of council. Before I dive in, there's a bit of housekeeping I want to cover. I'm just trying to make arrangements here. Okay, first thing, the staff report for this item may be found on page 1 through 61 of the addendum agenda. The clerk has also distributed a memo associated with this item that recommends revisions to the proposed zoning bylaw amendment and the related recommendation. And as for the 421 pages of appendices, while potentially overwhelming, council has seen the majority of this stuff before, and it provides the complete picture and context for the proposed amendments. And although we've provided a combined staff report, I want to be clear that this is the statutory public meeting for the proposed official plan amendment, file 42.24.019, which has a town-wide element and also provides policies specific to the Glen Abbey property. The statutory public meeting for the proposed zoning bylaw amendment, which relates to only the Glen Abbey property, was held at Planning and Development Council on December 5th. And the staff report is also a recommendation report as it relates to both amendments, and in that it recommends approval of both amendments. This is an overview of the presentation I'll be giving. I'll walk through a bit more of an introduction, the policy and regulatory framework, the obligation to conserve cultural heritage landscapes, the cultural heritage landscape strategy implementation, the proposed OPA and ZBA, as well as comments received and the consultation timeline, and staff's recommendation. The official plan and zoning bylaw amendments before you tonight are being proposed as a consequence of the completion of the town's cultural heritage landscape strategy implementation and the cultural heritage landscape assessment of the Glen Abbey property at 1333 Dorval Drive, shown here, as well as the town's urban structure review, in respect of which the interim control bylaw was enacted for the property. The amendments have been brought forward for consideration today because the interim control bylaw expires tomorrow. The Glen Abbey property comprises approximately 92.7 hectares between Dorval Drive and Upper Middle Road, including a portion of the 16 Mile Creek Valley. It is occupied by the Glen Abbey Golf Course, frequent host of the Canadian Open Golf Championship, including associated buildings and structures such as the clubhouse, the maintenance building, and the Rador Estate office building. The property is owned by Club Link Corporation, ULC, and Club Link Holdings Limited, and although the property is made up of several parcels, 1333 Dorval Drive is a convenience address we use to describe it. The town's cultural heritage landscapes, including the Glen Abbey Golf Course cultural heritage landscape, are being identified and evaluated in the context of provincial legislation and policies, as well as regional and local policies and regulations. Since it came into force in 2011, the Livable Oakville Plan has included the policy that the town shall identify, evaluate, and conserve cultural heritage landscapes in accordance with the Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy. The Region of Halton official plan contains the goal to protect the material, cultural, and built heritage of Halton for future generations, as well as objectives to retain community identity and preserve certain landscapes permanently, and also to preserve certain landscapes as part of Halton's cultural heritage resources. But perhaps most importantly, the 2014 PPS and the 2017 Growth Plan, which apply to all planning decisions, contain directive policies that require the conservation of significant cultural heritage landscapes. While both the 2014 PPS and the 2017 Growth Plan promote the efficient use of land and infrastructure, intensification within built-up areas, they also place constraints on growth and development in order to ensure the appropriate management and conservation of resources and the protection of public health and safety. Thus, in applying planning policy, a distinction must be made between those policies that are general in nature and those that are more directive. As an example, one part of the growth plan states that municipalities will develop a strategy which will encourage intensification generally to achieve the desired urban structure. In contrast, another section of the growth plan states that cultural heritage resources will be conserved. Both the PPS and growth plan rely on the same definition of cultural heritage landscape and conserved. Conserved means the identification, protection, management, and use of built heritage resources, cultural heritage landscapes, and archaeological resources in a manner that ensures their cultural heritage value or interest is retained under the Ontario Heritage Act. OPA 16, which was adopted last fall and is currently being reviewed for approval by Halton Region, updates the Livable Oakville Plan's cultural heritage policies and definitions to be consistent with the 2014 PPS and 2017 Growth Plan. It says that the town shall conserve cultural heritage landscapes in accordance with the Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy. So Jane already touched on this, but we're just going to walk briefly through the Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy implementation. In Phase 1, work related to the townwide cultural heritage landscape strategy has been ongoing since 2014. On February 26, 2016, Council endorsed the CHL inventory, including the Raydor Estate / Glen Abbey property at 1333 Dorval Drive. The Phase 2 evaluation of the Glen Abbey property by a multidisciplinary team of experts found that the property has local, provincial, and national significance, and the heritage designation that applied only to the Raydor Estate on the property was insufficient to recognize and protect the significant cultural heritage landscape. On May 15, 2017, based on staff's recommendation, Council recognized the Glen Abbey property and 3 other properties as significant cultural heritage landscapes that would proceed to Phase 3 implementation and protection measures. As part of Phase 3, all 4 properties recognized in Phase 2 will be subject to additional research and evaluation, as well as the recommendation of appropriate measures to conserve their cultural heritage value or interest and their heritage attributes. However, pursuant to the interim control bylaw, the cultural heritage landscape assessment of the Glen Abbey Golf Course was given the highest priority for completion. On August 21, 2017, based on staff's recommendation and the research and evaluation provided in reports by golf course design expert Ken Moody and cultural heritage landscape expert Julian Smith, Council adopted a notice of intention to designate under Section 29, Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act for the entire Glen Abbey property. On August 24, 2017, that notice, which included a statement of cultural heritage value and a description of heritage attributes, was provided to the property owners and the Ontario Heritage Trust and published in the Oakville Beaver newspaper. One objection to the proposed heritage designation was filed with the Conservation Review Board, but when that objection was withdrawn, Council proceeded. And, as we all know, on December 20th, 2017, Council passed Bylaw 2017-138 to designate the Glen Abbey Golf Course property at 1333 Dorval Drive as a property of cultural heritage value and interest pursuant to Section 29, Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and Schedule B to that bylaw sets out the statement of cultural heritage value or interest and a description of heritage attributes for the property as a designed cultural heritage landscape. The heritage designation is a site-specific conservation measure available under the Ontario Heritage Act, but other cultural heritage landscape conservation measures are being proposed on a town-wide basis and specific to the Glen Abbey property, as shown on tonight's agenda. The measures available under the Planning Act include official plan and zoning bylaw amendments. As a bit of context, Council will recall that through OPA 15, urban structure, heritage conservation districts and cultural heritage landscapes were identified as urban structure elements on the updated Schedule A1 urban structure. And through OPA 16, updates to the Livable Oakville Plan's cultural heritage policies were adopted that treat heritage conservation districts and cultural heritage landscapes much the same, including the potential for area-specific policies to support their conservation. Irrespective of those amendments, the Livable Oakville Plan currently states that the powers and tools provided by the Planning Act will be used in implementing the cultural heritage policies of the town. The purpose of the proposed Official Plan Amendment 24 to the Livable Oakville Plan is to provide the general town-wide framework to recognize special policy areas for heritage conservation districts and cultural heritage landscapes, and land use designations and policies to support the protection, management, and use of the Glen Abbey Golf Course cultural heritage landscape in a manner that ensures its cultural heritage value or interest and heritage attributes as established by Bylaw 2017-138, designating the property under Section 29 of the Heritage Act, are retained. The land use designations for the Glen Abbey property are provided on Schedules H and I of the Livable Oakville Plan. The property is currently designated private open space and natural area, and there is also a small portion of the golf course adjacent to Golf View Court that is designated residential low density, and that is in the upper left. Legally existing golf courses are permitted in the private open space designation, and legally existing uses are permitted in the natural area designation. The circle symbols on this map indicate that the property is subject to site-specific exception policies. Section 27.3.4 of the plan applies to the portion of the property in the private open space designation and allows for additional uses related to the principal golf course use, including a hotel/conference center, banquet and dining facilities, limited retail, service commercial, manufacturing, and storage. Section 27.3.5 of Livable Oakville applies to the portion of the property within the natural area designation and relates to the restoration of the golf course within the valley if damaged by a natural disaster. The effect of the proposed OPA to land use schedules H and I of the Livable Oakville Plan would be to identify a new special policy area applying to the entire Glen Abbey Golf Course property that will relate to new policies in Section 26 special policy areas of the plan. It would also delete the circular exception policy symbols from Schedule H because the related exception policies would also be deleted, and it would change the low-density residential land use designation applying to the small portion of the property adjacent to Golf View Court to private open space. Within the plan text, the proposed OPA would delete the exception policies that apply to the Glen Abbey property. It would add a new subsection entitled Heritage Conservation Districts and Cultural Heritage Landscapes to Section 26, Special Policy Areas. And this will establish the general town-wide framework to establish special policy areas for heritage conservation districts and cultural heritage landscapes. The special policy areas are intended to provide specific policies beyond the general policies and underlying land use designations and associated policies of the plan to support the conservation of these areas. as part of the town's ongoing implementation of provincial and local cultural heritage conservation policies, as well as the Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy Implementation Phase 3, it is anticipated that additional OPAs will be brought forward within this general townwide framework to establish special policy areas and associated policies for designated heritage conservation districts and other designated cultural heritage landscapes within the town. In the context of the described new framework for heritage special policy areas, the OPA proposed would establish policies to support the protection, management, and use of the Glen Abbey Golf Course cultural heritage landscape in a manner that ensures that its cultural heritage value or interest and heritage attributes are retained as set out in the designating bylaw. As set out in the proposed OPA bylaw 2018-015, and also is shown in Appendix I. In response to comments from Club Link, the proposed OPA was revised, as noted on page 54 of the staff report, to provide some flexibility to allow additions to existing buildings or new buildings exclusively devoted to the operation and maintenance of the golf course. Such changes would be subject to approval under the Ontario Heritage Act, as well as zoning approval. Now, moving on to the proposed zoning bylaw amendment. The purpose of the zoning bylaw amendment to the town's zoning bylaw 2014-014 is to regulate the use of the Glen Abbey property and the erection, location, and use of buildings and structures on it to ensure that the cultural heritage value or interest and heritage attributes as described by bylaw 2017-138, designating the property under Section 29 of the Heritage Act, are retained. This slide shows the property with zoning lines overlaid. The property is zoned O2, private open space, and N, natural area, and there is a special provision that applies to 3 defined areas near the Rador Estate House, sort of in the middle bottom there. And that special provision permits a hotel, accessory manufacturing, residential accommodation for caretakers and maintenance staff, and a public hall. And it includes regulations specific to these areas only. The proposed zoning bylaw amendment includes the map changes illustrated here. Within the Glen Abbey property, the extent of the natural area and private open space zones would not change. The proposed zoning bylaw amendment would delete special provision 114, which currently applies only to the pink areas, and apply a new special provision 114 to the entire property. The blue area would also be subject to a new holding provision, or H symbol. The proposed zoning bylaw amendment would apply, as I mentioned, a new special provision to the entire property. The special provision would identify specific blocks within the property which would be subject to specific use permissions and regulations, and these are all detailed in the staff report and the proposed bylaw. The effect would be to permit the existing golf course and the existing accessory uses, as well as the existing office uses in the Rador Estate office building, and allow all existing buildings and structures, as well as temporary structures related to golf tournaments. As noted on page 53 of the staff report, the zoning bylaw amendment was revised to permit manufacturing and storage accessory to the golf course within the upland portion of the property, as provided for in the existing official plan and the proposed OPA 24. The existing zoning permits a hotel within 3 defined areas of the Glen Abbey property in the vicinity of, but excluding, the Rador Estate office building. The proposed zoning bylaw amendment would also permit a hotel within a single newly defined block surrounding the Rador Estate office building and main parking lot, subject to a condition applied through a new holding provision or a holding symbol H. As noted on page 53 of the staff report, the zoning bylaw amendment was revised to permit a public hall within the same defined area where a hotel is permitted and subject to the same holding provision. Before the owner could apply to council for a bylaw to be passed to remove the H symbol, it would have to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the town that the proposed alteration of the property to provide a hotel or public hall has been subject to a heritage impact assessment and has received town consent under Section 33 of the Ontario Heritage Act. And as noted in the memo distributed today, with respect to item 1, based on comments from Club Link received this morning, staff is recommending minor revisions to the uses permitted prior to the removal of the H symbol and the staff recommendation related to the zoning bylaw amendment. The revision to the holding provision would permit, for such time that the H symbol is in place, the golf course as well as accessory uses within existing buildings, not just existing uses as previously proposed. This slide provides an overview of the consultation timeline. You'll recall we initially proposed the zoning bylaw amendment and then flagged at that time that an OPA was being considered, and we subsequently brought an information report forward about the OPA. On January 10th, we held an open house / public information meeting about the proposed OPA, the proposed zoning bylaw amendment, as well as the other conservation measures before you tonight. And tonight, we're here for the statutory public meeting about the proposed OPA and a recommendation report about the proposed OPA and zoning bylaw amendment, as well as the memo distributed earlier. So, staff's recommendation is quite a mouthful. I'm not going to repeat it. It is the same as provided in the staff report, with the exception of the amendment provided in the memo, which is underlined here, because we have revised the proposed bylaw 2018-016, the zoning bylaw amendment. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there questions? Councillor Elgar?
Thank you very much for that short presentation. Have you reviewed the additional information that was received on this item? And if so, have you considered any changes to the staff recommendation on this, other than the one you just highlighted?
Through you, Mayor Burton, yes, we've reviewed the information received, and the revisions considered are before you tonight through either as noted in the staff report or as noted in the memo you've already received.
Okay, thank you very much, because I know there was input on 2 occasions in this area. Thank you.
Councillor O'Meara?
Thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind just flashing back to slide 19 for a second there. Where I think you're discussing the prospects of of a hotel at the top of bank. Would that be subject to the Conservation Authority or setbacks from the ravine?
There is excuse me, through you, Mayor Burton, there is an existing regulation about a setback from the stable top of bank in the special provision that applies now, and that is being carried forward and has been reviewed by Conservation Halton. But of course, anything in proximity to this valley is also subject to Conservation Halton approval.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Your Worship.
Anyone else? Madam Clerk, would you call the registered delegations?
Our first delegation speaking to this item is Peter Longo.
Mr. Longo, welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
Good evening, Your Worship, Mayor Burton, Town Councillors, Town Staff, and fellow Oakville citizens. Thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to speak in support of Oakville Town Council's approval of the recommendations as outlined in the report from Town Planning Services Department and the report from the Town Legal Department, both dated January 22nd, 2018, relating to passing bylaws 2018-015, 016, 019, and 020. The current and future generations of this town depend on its mayor and councillors, with the support from staff, to make the best decisions on behalf of the citizens, and that's no easy task. We know there are tremendous pressures to manage growth in a highly desirable municipality. In fact, the Minister of Municipal Affairs, Bill Morrow, indicated this in May 2017 with the release of 4 updated land use plans that will help manage growth in the greater Golden Horseshoe, which includes Oakville. He stated, "This region will continue to experience a lot of growth in the coming years. So we need to be wise about the way we plan and build our communities. these revised plans provide a smarter approach by making more efficient use of land, resources, and infrastructure so that we can protect our environment, preserve precious farmland, boost our economy, address climate change, and develop smart, sustainable, transit-supportive communities. The town is very much in tune with this approach with its Livable Oakville plan. By passing the bylaws being considered today, you are further protecting the cultural and natural heritage of Oakville. You have an opportunity and a responsibility to do the right thing on behalf of the citizens of Oakville, which, in this case, is to take measures to permanently protect Glen Abbey Golf Course from further development or destruction. Your Worship, Mayor Burton, members of Town Council, please continue to protect the heart of Oakville in order to allow our community to cherish the cultural and natural heritage that defines it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Longo, for your information. Councillor, are there questions? Thank you, sir. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Next delegation is Mike Safran, Director of the Joshua Creek Residents Association.
Welcome, Mr. Safran. Council looks forward to your information.
Good evening, Mayor Burton and Town Council. My name is Mike Safran, and I'm here tonight on behalf of the Joshua Creek Residents Association, the Lakeside Residents Association, the Trafalgar Chartwell Residents Association, and the Chartwell Maple Grove Residents Association. Our four residents associations are some of the Southeast Oakville voices that wish to delegate on this important matter. We have been actively involved in Livable Oakville and monitor closely proposed changes to ensure the character of our town is respected and thoughtfully planned. We have been following and commenting on the initiatives of town staff, the Fairway Residents Association, Save the Glen Abbey Committee, and concerned citizens in the town for many months in regards to Glen Abbey. Hence our comments tonight. There is no doubt that Glen Abbey is an essential part of what makes Oakville unique. Given the evidence in town staff reports, Halton Region and provincial policy directives, we believe that Glen Abbey qualifies as a cultural heritage landmark with a cultural heritage landscape and should be protected. We see it as the responsibility of Town Council to approve the requisite bylaws and continue to preserve this important cultural district in Oakville. Therefore, we extend our support to the proposed official plan amendments to the Livable Oakville plan, adding a revised heritage conservation district and cultural heritage landscape, and a site-specific zoning bylaw amendments for the Glen Abbey Golf Course. We wish to thank Council and town staff for their excellent work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Safran, for your information. Are there questions? Thank you, sir. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Next delegation is Denise Baker on behalf of Fairway Hills Community Association.
Welcome, Ms. Baker. Council looks forward to your information.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of Council. I am the solicitor on behalf of the Fairway Hills Community Association. As you may know, Fairway Hills is located adjacent to the golf course property to the north and is the first residential community to be developed with the Glen Abbey Golf Course as the organizing design principle. We are supportive of the town staff's recommended town-initiated official plan amendment and the proposed town-initiated zoning bylaw amendment for the following reasons. As you will recall from previous delegations, my clients reviewed in detail the heritage reports that were completed by the town and their consultants and agreed with their conclusions as it related to the designation of the Glen Abbey Golf Course. As such, my clients were fully supportive of the town's notice of intention to designate the property, and therefore my clients are pleased to see the town move forward with the policies that support the protection, management, and use of the golf course and the golf course cultural heritage landscape in a manner that ensures that the cultural heritage value and the heritage attributes are retained. Frankly, we support this as the logical next step in the implementation of the designating bylaw for the property. And as you recall, at the time the town was considering the potential designation of the golf course lands, members of the Fairway Hills Community Association spoke to council and provided information to aid in the understanding of the history of the golf course and its impact not only on the Fairway Hills residents, but on the community of Oakville as a whole. My client is pleased to see that the town has taken the steps to propose policies that will support the protection of that history. In this regard, and among others, these policies are consistent with the 2017 provincial policy statement. It is also our opinion that the proposed policies and associated zoning regulations conform to the growth plan, especially insofar as the policies establish strategies for the wise use and management of cultural heritage resources and conform to the cultural heritage policies within the Region of Halton's official plan. Moreover, it's our opinion that the proposed policies have regard for Section 2 of the Planning Act, which requires council, in carrying out its responsibilities under that act, to have regard for, among other matters, the conservation of features of significant architectural, cultural, and heritage interest. We also share the opinion of town staff that the Glen Abbey Golf Course lands are not an appropriate location for a new growth area or node within the town. In terms of the specific details of the policies, my client supports the uses provided for in the proposed official plan amendment within the private open space designation, including the exception that uses accessory to the golf courses are generally only to be permitted within existing buildings. We also recognize the hotel and proposed conference center, or public hall, I think it's been identified as, proposed to be permitted on a specific portion of the site, and are pleased to see that such a use will be reviewed through Section 33 of the Heritage Act to ensure that it conforms with the identified cultural value and heritage attributes. Additionally, we believe it reasonable to permit new buildings or additions to existing buildings if they are related to the operation and maintenance of the golf course, subject, of course, to their review under the Heritage Act, and they're having no negative impact on the cultural value and heritage attributes identified in the designating bylaw. It therefore flows that we also support the amendments to the zoning bylaw that implement those official plan policies. Additionally, we strongly support staff's opinion that any proposed land use that would result in the removal of the golf course would fail to conserve the cultural heritage value and heritage attributes of the cultural heritage landscape as identified in the designating bylaw. And in conclusion, we are supportive of the proposed zone policies and zoning regulations that permit appropriate land uses on the golf course while still maintaining the cultural value and its heritage attributes. And it is for this reason, together with the foregoing comment, that my client is supportive of the recommendations of staff and respectfully requests that you, council, support your staff's recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you for your information. Are there questions for Ms. Baker? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Next delegation speaking to this item is Karen Brock from representing Oakville Green.
Welcome, Ms. Brock. Council looks forward to your information.
Good evening. My comments will be brief. I'm representing Oakville's largest residents association, residents from all over Oakville. And I think it's important to say that we've been following this issue pretty carefully, and we're supported by countless residents who agree with town's approach and fully support the recommendations of staff to, particularly in the areas of natural heritage protection as well as the cultural heritage landscape. Also, land use planning, I think, is very critical. We're at a point where we have to do some smart planning. We realize that urban sprawl isn't going to cut it, and we cannot survive. It's not sustainable. Intensification in the areas that our municipality has identified make a lot of sense, and Glen Abbey is not one of those areas, and we need to protect it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brock. Are there questions for Ms. Brock? Thank you, ma'am. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Our last listed delegation is Mark Flowers from Club Link Corporation and Club Link Holdings.
Welcome, Mr. Flowers. Council looks forward to your information.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. My name is Mark Flowers. I'm a lawyer with Davies Howe LLP, and I represent Club Link. And on behalf of Club Link, we filed a written submission with the clerk yesterday, providing comments both on the proposed official plan amendment as well as the proposed zoning bylaw amendment. I understand you have that as part of your package. We do not support either of the proposed instruments that are being recommended by town staff. With respect to the town-wide portion of the proposed OPA, it incorporates cultural heritage-related terms that are proposed to be redefined through OPA 16, and the document even specifically tells us one of the bases upon which this OPA is being brought forward is OPA 16. As you will recall, OPA 16 was adopted by council at the end of September. As you heard from your staff tonight, OPA 16 has not yet been approved. It's with the region of Halton, still awaiting approval. And even once it is approved, of course, it is subject to appeals or potential appeals to the Ontario Municipal Board. So as we stand here today, we don't know what the outcome of OPA 16 is going to be. And yet OPA 24 says that OPA 16 is in fact one of the bases upon which it is being brought forward. So with that, it's our position, in fact, that council should await the outcome of OPA 16 before considering OPA 24, which is before you this evening. Turning to the Glen Abbey portion of OPA 24, as recently as last week, staff advised that they were revising the draft official plan amendment to reference the term heritage attributes in the section where it speaks to ensuring that the cultural heritage value or interest of a heritage property is retained. That was the wording previously. Now it adds in and heritage attributes. We do not support the proposed addition, in part because it's our view it's not consistent with the language in the provincial policy statement, and in fact it's not even consistent with the town's OPA 16 as adopted. It appears to us that the introductory text of the portion of OPA 24 that is specific to the Glen Abbey property draws on the definition of conserve in the PPS, which I think staff put that up on the presentation earlier. That's proposed to be carried forward into the town's official plan by virtue of OPA 16. So again, one of the things OPA 16 was going to do was ensure consistency in the terminology that's used in the PPS. However, it appears to us now that the definition of conserved, again, which does not reference heritage attributes, the problem now is that through this OPA, in fact, that's the proposal, is to change that definition and add that in as an additional item. In our view, there's no need, nor is it appropriate to include reference to the term heritage attributes as proposed. In addition, we do not support the proposed elimination of existing use permissions from the official plan that are proposed through this OPA. There's been no justification provided by staff for such changes. And finally, the proposed OPA includes a policy that would place restrictions on new buildings or addition to existing buildings, even where such buildings or additions are exclusively for the existing use of the golf course. We do not support the proposed restrictions, but I'll speak more directly to that issue in my comments on the draft zoning bylaw, to which I'll now turn. Whereas the proposed OPA refers to buildings and building additions, the draft bylaw proposes to go even further than that by restricting any new buildings or additions, or not only that, but to also reference structures. And as you heard again from staff, the only permission for new structures would be temporary ones associated with tournament golf. So no new structures, no new buildings, even if they are directly associated with the golf course use. So just a couple of examples of that. And first off, what I'll say is, in terms of structure, structure is defined in your zoning bylaw. It's a very broad definition. It's defined as anything that is erected, built, or constructed of parts joined together. Obviously, that could include a lot of things, and could include a lot of things that you might find at a golf course. So for example, if Club Link wanted to erect some form of antenna, let's say, for weather monitoring, it's not uncommon at golf courses to want to warn golfers of inclement weather that's coming. Any new structure of that sort would be prohibited under this bylaw. Similarly, if the if Club Link's members requested a new washroom to be erected on the golf course. There are some washroom facilities, as I understand, already, but if they wanted a new one built somewhere in the course, that too would be prohibited under this zoning bylaw. And the irony, Council, is that this bylaw is even more restrictive than the town's interim control bylaw, which of course expires tomorrow, as the interim control bylaw prohibited uses, but it did not prohibit the erection of new buildings and structures associated with the existing golf course. What this demonstrates is that although the town will publicly state its support for the continued operation of the golf course, its actions state otherwise. Town staff's response, I'm sure, will be that because of the town's identification of a cultural heritage landscape, they must prohibit any new permanent buildings or structures in the zoning bylaw to preserve the integrity of the cultural heritage resource. However, that is simply not the case. As long as the property is subject to the recently enacted heritage designation bylaw that you passed on December 20th, any alteration of the property that would be likely to affect the property's heritage attributes would require the consent of this council through an application under Section 33 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Thus, there's no need to prohibit new buildings and structures or additions to existing buildings or structures in the zoning bylaw, which would then also trigger the need for a minor variance to the bylaw or possibly even a zoning bylaw amendment application. Again, especially if the proposed building or structure, using some of the examples that I gave you, might be relatively benign. And just by way of comparison, I'm going to be speaking later this evening to the town's proposed conservation plan, but I would note that in that document, it talks about that there may be alterations of a relatively minor nature that could potentially be approved by staff, and that includes possibly even new small buildings or structures. Again, that's an approval I'm talking about for heritage purposes under the Heritage Act. In the conservation plan, it indicates, staff says, that those type of applications could be considered and reviewed within no more than 5 business days. And that gives the impression, of course, that the town will be responsive to requests by Club Link for minor alterations and would be able to turn around such requests very quickly. What they fail to tell you, however, is that although an application under the Heritage Act may be dealt with rather expeditiously, by virtue of the bylaw that is now put before you for approval, Club Link would also have to go through a separate process to change the zoning of the property, which in my experience is always a multi-month process at best. And in many cases, of course, as you'll know, is subject to potential appeals to the Ontario Municipal Board. And the same goes, Council, for the potential hotel or conference center in the property. These permissions, I understand, date back to about 1980. And although there's no current proposal to build a hotel or conference center, your planning director has previously stated that such facilities would support, and this is in quotes, support the golf course use and enhance its economic and tourism role for the town. Well, if staff truly believes that, why would staff now be recommending imposing greater restrictions on such a use? Similarly, the proposed bylaw proposes to eliminate a number of other existing use permissions from the property that are set out in the existing zoning applicable to the property. We don't support those eliminations. So for all of these reasons, Club Link opposes the proposed official plan amendment that's before you. We oppose the zoning bylaw amendment that's before you. We therefore urge Council to reject the staff recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers, for your information. Are there questions for the gentleman? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Madam Clerk, that completes your list. Are there members of the public with information for Council on this matter? Madam Clerk, I see none. So I'll restrict it to table. And I will look for a motion. Looks like we might have one from Councillor Elgar.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Burton. After hearing what staff said related to the additional information they had and the changes they have made, I would like to move recommendation 1, 2, 3, and 4, and number 3 is the one with the memo that has been amended. I would move all 4 recommendations with the amended number 3. I haven't asked for a recorded vote.
Thank you, Councillor. Council, the revised motion that's before you in the memo is moved by Councillor Elgar. Is there discussion? Shall I put the vote? All those in favor of the motion, please rise to be named. Councillor Adams, Councillor Grant, Councillor Knoll, Councillor Elgar, Mayor Burton, Councillor Hutchins, Councillor Giddings, Councillor Chisholm, Councillor Robinson, Councillor O'Meara. I declare the measure carried. Now, Council, we must turn our attention to discussion item number 2, the proposed new Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan, Bylaw 2018-19, and proposed new Ontario Heritage Act Delegation Powers, Bylaw 2018-20. And there's a small title change there that you might want to notice. And as I understand it, we get to hear from Dennis Perlin on this. He looks loaded.
Oh, started off. What did you do?
A massive pile of information.
Go down.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, I'm going to be addressing both items 2 and 3 in terms of the totality of the bylaw framework that's being put in front of you this evening in this presentation. And I'm beginning with item 2, which is the proposed Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan Bylaw 2018-019. Now, item 2, with respect to that bylaw and the companion bylaw that is on the agenda this evening as well, the delegation bylaw, the Ontario Heritage Act Powers delegation bylaw, is on pages 483 to 489. That report deals with both of those. And the bylaw for the Conservation Plan 2018-019 is on pages 733 to 746, the actual bylaw. The bylaw, of course, the Conservation Plan bylaw, which is the first I'll be talking to under item 2, was in front of council on December the 12th, and there are a few substantive changes since that initial presentation to council and through the public consultation process. The bylaw itself has 7 parts. It is the bylaw that provides the enabling authority for the creation and enforcement of conservation plans in the town of Oakville for cultural heritage landscapes. And indeed, you will consider a proposed conservation plan for the cultural heritage landscape of Glen Abbey later. This addresses any cultural heritage landscape on protected heritage property that there may be now or in the future in Oakville. The bylaw would implement provincial law, policy, and direction respecting the conservation of cultural heritage landscapes on protected heritage properties in the town of Oakville. And as I said, there are 7 parts. The first part is interpretation. The second part is application and prohibitions related to the bylaw, when it applies, what is prohibited. Part 3, conservation plan approval and amendment. The preparation of that of approval of a plan and its approval and when and how it's amended. Part 4 is the assessment of the condition of protected heritage property. And Part 5 deals with proposals to alter the protected property in consideration of the conservation plan. Part 6 is the enforcement. There are prohibitions and the enforcement tools available in the Municipal Act, part of Part 6. And then Part 7 deals with conflicts, paramountcy, and miscellaneous. In terms of the highlights of the plan, the implementation, the Part 1 is actually interpretation. The definitions are the terminology needed for the town's approach to conservation of cultural heritage landscapes. The intent and purpose, this is a summary of the whole purpose of this bylaw, and that is the intent and purpose is to promote the conservation of cultural heritage resources by authorizing the preparation, the approval, the administration, and the enforcement of conservation plans for cultural heritage landscapes located on protected heritage property in the town. Part 2, in terms of the application and prohibitions, bylaw will apply to all cultural heritage landscapes on protected heritage properties, those which are designated under Part under Part 4 of the Heritage Act, those which are part of a cultural heritage district, a designated district under Part 5, and also those that are subject to a notice of intention to designate under Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act. But it does not apply to those parts of protected heritage properties that do not include a cultural heritage landscape. Some properties that may come in front of you may have a portion that is a cultural heritage landscape and another portion that is not. This bylaw only applies to that part that is a cultural heritage landscape. This Part 2 also sets out the requirement for a cultural heritage conservation plan and the requirement that all alterations be in accordance with the Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan. Part 3 deals with conservation plan approval and amendment. This part sets out the detailed requirements for the preparation, the approval, and the amendment of cultural heritage landscape conservation plans. Part 4 deals with the assessment of the condition of protected heritage property. It requires the preparation and approval of initial and subsequent heritage condition assessments for cultural heritage landscapes in relation to the cultural heritage value or interest in heritage attributes, and is done to ensure that the conservation plan is working in terms of the retention of the cultural heritage value or interest and the heritage attributes. It provides for the preparation of a new condition assessment every 5 years after the initial assessment is prepared. Part 5 deals with proposals to alter the protected heritage property. The procedure sets out the procedure respecting the obtaining of approvals, if necessary, of alterations to alter cultural heritage landscapes in keeping with the conservation plan for the cultural heritage landscape. So one of the requirements with respect to an alteration, even pursuant to Section 33 of the Heritage Act, is that in proposing the alteration, that it be in keeping with the conservation plan for that cultural heritage landscape. Part 6, in terms of enforcement, as I said earlier, there are prohibitions, and with prohibitions in a municipal bylaw, that bylaw, as in the normal course, incorporates municipal enforcement powers such as inspections, orders. It also provides Section 46 Municipal Act work done by municipality. If work isn't done that's required in terms of the conservation plan bylaw, then the town itself could undertake that pursuant to 446 and charge the cost back to the owner, and of course, where necessary. And then there are the offenses and penalties for bylaw contravention as provided for in the Municipal Act. Part 7 is one that helps deal with conflicts. It's called conflicts, paramountcy, and miscellaneous. That sets out what governs in terms of the bylaw regime that the town may have. As you will see in the next part of this presentation, there are a number of other bylaws that affect heritage resources in the town. What prevails in terms of the various bylaws of that regime. In this particular, with respect to this particular bylaw concerning conservation plans, in conflicts, the bylaw prevails over the provisions in the Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan. In conflicts between the Ontario Heritage Act and the Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan bylaw, the Ontario Heritage Act prevails. In terms of other applicable town bylaws, they still will apply, so those that you will hear from me shortly, site alteration, property standards, tree protection, still apply to protected heritage properties with cultural heritage landscape conservation plans, but in conflicts where a provision of this bylaw conflicts with the other town bylaws under the Municipal Act, or indeed made under the Building Code Act, then the provision that best ensures that the cultural heritage value or interest of the cultural heritage landscape is conserved prevails to the extent of the conflict, except with respect to the health or safety of persons. That is primary. So that's a quick review of the proposed cultural heritage landscape bylaw, Conservation Plan Bylaw 2018-019. The other bylaw before you this evening is the repeal and replacement of the present Ontario Heritage Act Delegation Powers Bylaw. That's 2011-115 as amended. The changes are being put forward with respect to the coming into being of the Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan bylaw, should that be passed, and the requirements there related to delegation. And it was thought best to then bring that together, as often is done here, in terms of a consolidation rather than just an amending bylaw. And this is a bylaw that's passed pursuant to the Ontario Heritage Act, which does allow council to delegate powers with respect to consents to alterations to individual properties designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and the granting of permits for alteration of properties situated in heritage conservation districts under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act to staff. The bylaw itself, in terms of the changes you will see from the previous delegation bylaw, does amend the definitions related to heritage matters to make them current. And then the bylaw is expanded, as I said, to delegate powers to the delegatee. In this case, it's the Director of Planning Services or his delegate to include consents for alterations to cultural heritage landscapes. Now that particular bylaw, before leaving it, is found on pages 747 to 751 on the agenda, and that completes my review of the delegation bylaw. In terms of item 3, which is the proposed changes to the other town regulatory bylaws affecting protected heritage properties, as I stated earlier, there are 3 such bylaws: the site alteration bylaw, the private tree protection bylaw, and the property standards bylaw. Item 3 is found on pages 491 to 583, including the track changed bylaws for your consideration, and that they are set out in those pages. The changes are to update and strengthen those bylaws in keeping with current provincial law, policy, and direction, and to assist as necessary with the implementation of Phase 3 of the Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy, as spoken to you about earlier from the Commissioner. The presentation was made of the Heritage Delegation Bylaw, which had not been in front of you previously, and was presented as part of the package of these proposed changes to these regulatory bylaws at the January 23rd, 2018 Heritage Oakville Advisory Committee meeting, and I believe there is a memo in front of you respecting the consideration by the Heritage Oakville Advisory Committee respecting all of those bylaws. The Conservation Plan bylaw was before Heritage Advisory Committee in December, and but the others went before the Heritage Advisory Committee on January 23rd. The changes that are set out, if they are acceptable in principle to Council this evening, then the amending bylaws will be put in proper town bylaw format and will be brought forward formally at a future Council meeting for Council consideration, and if acceptable, then adoption. In terms of the highlights of those other bylaws, there are common changes to all three in the definition and interpretation portions of those bylaws. They're updated to current definitions, descriptions, and terminology for the various aspects of heritage conservation, for protected heritage properties and cultural heritage landscapes. The changes recognize the existence of cultural heritage landscapes in protected heritage properties. The changes are designed to better fit the regulatory bylaws together and avoid or minimize overlap and duplication. They provide for more common and better enforcement of these regulatory bylaws, and they provide for paramountcy of conservation of heritage value or interest and heritage attributes, except with respect to health or safety of persons. In terms of more specific changes, site alteration addresses the term structure in the realm of protected heritage properties and cultural heritage landscapes. The changes also expressly provide that for protected heritage properties, any decision on a site alteration permit application must ensure that the heritage value or interest and heritage attributes are considered by the provision of a heritage impact assessment as part of the site alteration permit application for a protected heritage property. In terms of the private tree protection bylaw, that's a recent bylaw that was passed by Council. There are some changes in that beyond the common that staff believe better address heritage conservation as necessary in the tree removal permit process. And in terms of the third bylaw, the property standards bylaw, the specific changes amend those parts, including Part 10 for heritage properties, to better reflect the town's current approach to the conservation of heritage value or interest and the maintenance of the heritage attributes of protected heritage properties, including cultural heritage landscapes. And with that, Mr. Mayor, members of Council, that's my presentation on both items 2 and 3 before you this evening.
Let me see if there are questions for you, sir. Council, are there questions for Mr. Perlin? Councillor Elgin.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Burton. I'm just wondering, like since you have, again, similar questions, since you received further correspondence when this was issued, has staff received and considered any changes to the staff recommendations that we have before us tonight?
We have received very recently some letters that have suggested some concerns about the bylaws that are in front of you and some suggestions. We have perused those and staff are satisfied that the bylaws for passage this evening in front of you, the Conservation, Heritage Cultural Landscape Conservation Plan bylaw and the new delegation bylaw are suitable and appropriate for passage by council, despite the information that we've received and perused. And with respect to the other bylaws, again, we believe the changes are suitable, but those aren't formally in front of you this evening, and we'll come back, as I said, at a later date in formal format. So what's in front of you this evening,
Item
we
1,
stand
or
by
item
those.
2 and item 3 are both suitable after reviewing the comments received.
That's the position, yes.
I thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else? Madam Clerk, would you call the registered delegations?
The first registered delegation speaking to item 2 is Neil Huddlestone.
Mr. Huddlestone, welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
Thank you very much, Your Worship, members of council, staff, members of Save Glen Abbey, and the rest of the public. My name is Neil Huddlestone. I'm a resident of Oakville, and over the last number of months I've been most interested to significantly engage in the activities to understand what council is doing as it relates to the matter before us in terms of Glen Abbey. I'd like to give you a little bit of background. I was born in England, a little town called Hoylake on the northwest coast. I sailed to Canada in 1970 to seek my fortune. For those of you who are wondering, I'm still looking. I haven't quite got there. However, I did end up in this beautiful town because of its cultural value, because of its heritage. And I've come to the conclusion that this whole matter is getting too complicated. We either want to preserve the heritage and the culture of our community, or we don't. If the province agrees, and it seems like the various rules and regulations that they've come out with, in particular, I picked up on the word shall protect. If that is the case, then we need to take every step possible to protect the various parts of our community that represent our heritage. The other evening I drove through the heritage districts of this town, sort of as a little reminder to me of what it is that you as a council and staff have considered valuable from a heritage perspective to the town. And what I saw is the soul of this beautiful community, the things that make it different, the things that make it unique, the things that pull it away from the great urban sprawl that we have surrounding us in the Greater Toronto area, the things that make us proud to say we grow up in Oakville, our children are here, our grandchildren are here, and should be protected for the future. So I urge you to continue this journey. I admire the work that the staff have done. I am very pleased to see the level of detail and commitment that they have made going beyond their professional capacities. It's clear that they have a passion for what they do and do it in an excellent way. I want to appreciate and respect the work that you as a council do. First of all, I'm so impressed that you stay awake between 7 and 10 o'clock for these meetings. I find it difficult when I only attend part of these meetings. It's a tragedy that we're in this position today, that the Club Link has decided, for whatever reasons, and they have their own business reasons. I was a businessman for 30 years. I don't know why they don't want to continue this beautiful golf course. But I mentioned my heritage for one other reason. I grew up in a little town called Hoylake on the northwest coast of England. Anybody ever heard of Hoylake? One gentleman there. Turns out that in 2006, a young golfer by the name of Tiger Woods won the British Open in Hoylake. Now, Hoylake only has a population of 5,000 people, part of a larger community, that's 15,000 people, on the Wirral Peninsula, which is the peninsula between the River Mersey and the River Dee. So you're separating Liverpool from the beautiful country of Wales. Back in 1921, at the same golf course, was the very first amateur competition between the United States and Great Britain. In 1922, it officially became the Walker Cup. Not the Ryder Cup, that includes the rest of Europe, but the Walker Cup, which includes Ireland and Great Britain. So in 1921 was the very first amateur competition. By then, the little golf course in Hoylake, a population of 5,000, doing an amazing job in supporting a golf course, aren't they? Had been going since 1869. 1869. So that golf course, 149 years. When you go on the Royal Liverpool Golf Course website, because that's the name of the golf course, in 1871, one of the sons of the King and Queen played there, and so it got its royal designation. If you go on their website, they proudly talk about their heritage. Now, I realize that Glen Abbey as a golf course has only been here 42 years, so it's an infant. However, Britain's been there a long time. Canada only reached 150 last year. 42 years as a golf course, it's over a quarter of a lifetime for this country. It deserves protection. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you're doing. Carry on and get the job done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your information, sir. I see no questions. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
The next listed delegation speaking to item 2 is Mark Flowers.
Mr. Flowers, welcome back. Council looks forward to your information on these items.
Thank you, Mayor Burton and members of council. With respect to this item, agenda item 2, we filed a written submission in response to these 2 related draft bylaws with the clerk yesterday, and I understand that that is part of your package. Given the extensive problems with these proposed bylaws, I'm not going to be able to speak to all of our concerns in the limited time available. I do, however, intend to highlight some of the key problems we've identified. And I would also note that this is not just Club Link that is identifying concerns with these proposed bylaws, in particular the Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan bylaw. I see, when I arrived this evening, I see that as part of the package as well, there's a letter sent on behalf of BUILD. This is the Building Industry and Land Development Association, representing a broad spectrum of the development industry across the GTA. I also see that there's a letter from the president of the Oakville Chamber of Commerce, representing 1,200 businesses right here in your town. And they have both expressed concerns regarding the proposed bylaw, both in terms of the limited public consultation process and the actual content of the proposed bylaw. Let me start by saying, Council, that it is our position that the town simply does not have the authority to enact the proposed bylaws as drafted. The town does have some authority to pass bylaws in relation to cultural heritage. The town also has authority to delegate certain powers under the Heritage Act to staff, but not in the manner that is proposed in these bylaws that are before you. First, regarding the proposed conservation plan bylaw, staff claims that it is intended to treat cultural heritage landscape conservation plans as akin to a heritage conservation district plan under the Heritage Act. And I understand you have 4 heritage conservation districts here in the town. Each of those, therefore, would have an HCD plan. But the reality in looking at those plans and conservation plans for cultural heritage landscape that is designated under Part 4 and not Part 5 is that the two are simply not the same. Under the Heritage Act, there's a prescribed process for a municipality to prepare and obtain approval for an HCD plan. It includes rights of appeal to the OMB by affected landowners. Once an HCD plan is in place, applications to either alter property within the plan area or to erect, demolish, or remove buildings or structures in the plan area are also all appealable to the Ontario Municipal Board. By contrast, under the proposed plan, the conservation plan, the town seeks effectively to appoint itself as the sole authority for the approval, first of all, of terms of reference for a conservation plan, next for the approval of the plan itself, and thirdly, for any proposed amendments to the conservation plan. There's no requirement in the bylaw for the owner's consent or even the owner's involvement in the process. No right of appeal to the OMB or otherwise if the owner is unhappy with the plan that the town decides to approve. Thus, suggesting that the manner in which the town proposes to treat these conservation plans as being analogous to the manner in which the Ontario Heritage Act deals with HCD plans is, in our view, disingenuous. Secondly, the bylaw proposes to categorize various actions that may occur on a property with a cultural heritage landscape into one of three categories. Claims that if the action is on category A, it's exempt from heritage review. If it's on categories B or C, it's subject to an approvals process by the town. This approach to dealing with properties subject to a cultural heritage landscape is, in our view, fundamentally flawed, contrary to the Heritage Act, and I'm going to speak more to that when I comment on the way the approach is actually been employed in the proposed conservation plan for Glen Abbey, which I understand is item 4 on your agenda. Third, the bylaw proposes to impose a number of unauthorized obligations on property owners, particularly in relation to maintenance requirements. For example, the bylaw could require an owner to prepare what's referred to as an initial heritage condition assessment for council's approval. Presumably that's at the owner's expense, and then require that same owner every 5 years to prepare updates, again, at the owner's expense. Certainly where development is proposed, it's expected that the owner is going to bear the cost of preparing the necessary studies to support the development, and we saw that with Club Link's redevelopment applications, had to provide a number of studies to the town. But this is different. In this case, even where nothing is being proposed, the owner under this bylaw could incur significant costs to prepare this initial condition assessment, to prepare updates, and then it goes to council for approval. What happens if council doesn't agree with the owner's assessment of its property? Well, who knows? The bylaw is simply silent on that issue. Therefore, the bylaw, at least in this respect, is vague and uncertain. Further, the bylaw proposes a requirement for the owner to then ensure that the property, this is quoting from the bylaw, retains or improves its assessed heritage condition. That goes well beyond its authority to establish minimum standards. That's the term that's used in the Act, minimum standards. And it goes well beyond an attempt to prevent demolition by neglect, which is what the staff report says this provision is intended to address. The absurd result, Council, is that this bylaw could very well require an owner to prepare an updated condition assessment at the owner's expense that the town could then use to attempt to prosecute that same owner for non-compliance with the bylaw if, in fact, the update indicates that the heritage condition has not been retained or improved. Another reason why the bylaw is flawed is it's based on a false premise. The authors appear to be under the misapprehension, and you saw it just a few moments ago in speaking about the conflict provisions, that the conservation of cultural heritage resources is viewed in provincial law and provincial policy as standing above all other considerations with the exception of public health and safety. And that is simply not correct. The PPS, the growth plan, for example, they include cultural heritage conservation, but just as one of many policy objectives, and certainly not one that stands above all others in importance. Turning to the proposed delegation powers bylaw, because it is related to the Cultural Heritage Conservation Plan bylaw, it suffers from many of the same problems. In addition, it proposes to delegate certain powers to staff that in fact the Heritage Act specifically says cannot be delegated. I'll give you an example. The Heritage Act distinguishes between applications to alter a heritage property versus an application to demolish or remove a building or structure. The former is under Section 33 of the Heritage Act, the latter is under Section 34, and as I'm sure Council knows, in fact, ClubLink has in fact exercised its right and has filed a Section 34 application. Although the Heritage Act authorizes Council to delegate the power to approve alteration applications, it simply does not authorize the delegation of powers to approve applications to demolish or remove buildings or structures. Meanwhile, if you turn to Section 3 of the proposed bylaw, 2018-020, there are two fundamental problems, or at least two fundamental problems. You'll see there that in the introductory text, it refers to the items that follow and uses the term alterations. So it's treating those following items as alterations. It then proposes to delegate the power to approve those alterations to the director. But when you actually turn to the list of items, and I draw your attention in particular to items C and H, you'll see that it references not just alterations, it references applications for removal. Removal of various structures and various buildings. Again, that's simply not an authorized delegation to staff under the Heritage Act. Again, I'm not standing here before telling you that you should or that staff should or should not make those decisions. I'm simply telling you it's not authorized in the very legislation that governs these matters. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, again, I read it quickly, I think the letter from the lawyer for Build highlights one of those items as well. In summary, Council, there are numerous problems with the proposed bylaws, both of them, as they've been presented to Council. In many instances, the provisions of these bylaws as drafted are in conflict, as I noted, with the Heritage Act or otherwise beyond the town's bylaw-making authority. And as a result, we urge Council to reject the staff recommendation, which is to pass the bylaw. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers, for your information. You indicated that you felt pressed for time. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I've made a written submission. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that. It certainly is more extensive than what I've said, but I knew that I was limited to 10 minutes. I'm happy to obviously finish within the 10 minutes, so I covered the highlights that I wanted to address.
Thank you very much for your information. Are there questions? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Madam Clerk, the next, no others? Are there members of the public with information for Council on this item or items?
I only did two. I didn't call for three. I only did item two. I didn't call for delegations on item three.
Well, let's deal with number two then, and then we'll deal with number three. Council, I'd like to look for a motion for discussion item number two. That's the two bylaws we're discussing here. Councillor O'Meara, thank you. Is there discussion? Shall I put the vote? A recorded vote. To be recorded in favor of these two bylaws, please rise to be. Oh, wait. Before we call the vote, I'd like to ask a question. Commissioner Closey, in regard to the submissions about the authority under the Act, have you heard any need to make any changes to the proposals before us?
I have not, Mr. Mayor, but I would actually think that question should be directed to legal.
Well, then, it was my hope you might direct it to whoever you wanted to answer it. Mr. Carr.
Mr. Mayor, I believe Mr. Flowers' representations are consistent with his written submissions, which we have reviewed, and we have no further changes or recommendations to make to you.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. To be recorded in favor of the motion by Councillor O'Meara, please rise to be named. Councillor Adams, Councillor Grant, Councillor Knoll, Councillor Elgar, Mayor Burton, Councillor Hutchins, Councillor Giddings, Councillor Chisholm, Councillor Robinson, Councillor O'Meara. I declare the measures carried. Council, we now will turn to item number 3. These are the proposed amendments to existing town bylaws related to cultural heritage and protected heritage properties. And all that's asked for here is that council endorse the described amendments, which, if endorsed tonight, will be brought forward in proper bylaw form at a later meeting. And I understand that, Mr. Flowers, did you want to speak to this as well? I do. You're welcome to.
Thank you once again, Mayor Burton and members of council. On this item, we did as well file a written submission with the clerk yesterday in response to the 3 proposed bylaw amendments. As a general statement about all 3 of the bylaw amendments, they all propose to incorporate elements and references to the proposed, I guess now I should say, the now enacted Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan bylaw. So therefore, in the interest of time, I don't propose to repeat the comments that I've just made regarding that bylaw. Rather, I'll simply say that to the extent that there is any overlap between the various bylaws, we continue to have concerns for the reasons that I've already highlighted in my earlier submissions. I do, however, wish to make some additional comments that are specific to the proposed amendments to the property standards bylaw. And as we noted in our written submission, it's actually not possible for us to properly understand how the various amendments to this bylaw are intended to operate, as there's numerous formatting problems with the version of the bylaw that staff has made available to the public on the town's website. In fact, there's no section numbers to this bylaw. So you'll read through a provision, it'll say, whereas section such and such, or notwithstanding, there is no section numbers in this bylaw. I checked the town's website this afternoon, shortly before leaving to come here, and still the only version that is available for public review is the version that does not have section numbers that I have reviewed. In any event, from what we've been able to glean from the version provided, it's apparent that various amendments that are proposed, particularly in Part 10, that's the section dealing with heritage properties, are in conflict with the Heritage Act or otherwise are invalid. For example, the amendments propose to establish minimum maintenance standards for what is referred to and is defined as protected heritage property. It's proposed to be defined as including property that is subject to a notice of intention to designate under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Now, by contrast, the province also uses the defined term protected heritage property, but it does not include properties that are subject to a notice of intention to designate, only designated properties. The Heritage Act only provides authority to pass a bylaw to establish minimum maintenance standards for heritage purposes for lands that are actually designated, either individually under Part 4 or as part of a heritage conservation district under Part 5, but again, not to properties that are only subject to a notice of intention to designate. Therefore, the proposed amendment is in direct conflict with the Heritage Act. In addition, where the minimum maintenance standards are to be applied, they are extremely vague and subjective. For example, and I'll read from the bylaw, because it's entirely unclear, to me at least, what this would mean. There would be a requirement to, as in quotes, maintain the elements and features of a protected heritage property that hold up, support, or protect the heritage value or interest and heritage attributes, without which the heritage value or interest or heritage attributes of the protected heritage property may be at risk. Aside from being a mouthful, that is very unclear what that means. And I'm not a heritage expert, but again, most property owners are not heritage experts. And this is what they would be faced with in terms of minimum maintenance standard for their property. That's the test. Council, a basic principle of any municipal bylaws, I'm sure you know, especially one that places restrictions or obligations on property owners and provides penalties for noncompliance, is that the bylaw provisions must be sufficiently clear so that the owner can determine whether or not an activity that they propose to do would put them at risk of potential prosecution for noncompliance. That's why bylaws need to be very clear and not use vague and subjective language as I've just read to you. In our view, the passage from the bylaw that I just read does not come close to meeting that required standard. In addition, you've heard that there are enforcement provisions under these bylaws. How is a municipal bylaw officer, and I'm guessing that most of your officers are not trained specifically in heritage, cultural heritage, but how would a municipal bylaw officer be capable of objectively enforcing such a vague provision. Finally, where the property includes a cultural heritage landscape that is subject to a conservation plan, it says, the proposed amendments say that this would require the owner to, in quotes, adhere to or ensure consistency with the plan for any proposed action to alter the property. And I pause at the reference to altering the property. As I indicated earlier, if there's to be an alteration to a designated heritage property, that's governed by Section 33 of the Heritage Act for properties that are designated under Part 4. If the alteration is likely to affect the property's heritage attributes, it triggers the need for the municipality's consent for the alteration under Section 33. And if the alteration is not likely to affect the property's heritage attributes, no such consent is required. But again, that's a separate and distinct process from establishing minimum maintenance standards in this, a property standards bylaw. I understand that the bylaws are not being put forward this evening for enactment, but you are being asked to endorse them. Given the problems that I've identified with these proposed bylaws, we urge Council to reject that staff recommendation and therefore not endorse any of the 3 bylaw amendments that have been put before you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers. In the alternative, would you settle for asking staff to consider your remarks?
Well, I certainly hope that they would consider the remarks. That
wouldn't be mutually exclusive then to endorse and wait to see the final result, would it?
I would say you should not endorse. If you're asking staff to consider the remarks and report back at the time when the bylaws may come forward, then I would ask that Council not endorse these bylaws tonight.
Okay, I think we understand you then. Thank you very much for your information. Are there questions for the gentleman? Are there members of the public with information for Council on this matter? I'll look to a motion. Councillor Knoll.
I'd be pleased to move the staff recommendation.
Thank you. Councillor Knoll has part of the golf course in his ward, so we're sharing the duties around here. A recorded vote. Recorded votes are popular tonight. All right, if there's no further discussion, I'll put the vote. Please rise to be named in support of the motion by Councillor Knoll. Councillor Adams, Councillor Grant, Councillor Knoll, Councillor Elgar, Mayor Burton, Councillor Hutchins, Councillor Giddings, Councillor Chisholm, Councillor Robinson, Councillor O'Meara. I declare the measure carried. Council, we now need to turn our attention to number 4, the Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan for the Glen Abbey property. And if we give our attention to the staff podium, Diane Childs is ready to summarize for us who've read it and for the public who may be watching this measure. Ms. Childs, we are all ears.
Okay. Just give me a second. Good evening, Your Worship and members of Council. The item 4 today that I'm here to present, the Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan for the Glen Abbey property, can be found on page 585 of tonight's agenda. We have some of the core team members with us tonight who developed the conservation plan, and I wanted to give your attention to Christophe Rivet and to Angus Affleck sitting in the audience. In addition, the clerk has provided a memo from staff and an updated conservation plan for the property for Council's consideration this evening. The conservation plan is part of Phase 3 of the Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy implementation. Here's a brief overview of the Phase 3 to date. On August 23rd, 2017, notice of intention to designate the cultural heritage landscape on the Glen Abbey property was issued, followed by the resolution of Council on August 21st. On September 26th, Council adopted an official plan amendment to the Livable Oakville Plan, which provides direction on how the town ensures that significant cultural heritage landscapes are to be conserved, including through cultural heritage landscape conservation plans. On December 12th, a special Planning and Development Council meeting that released the draft Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan was held. On December 19th, Heritage Oakville endorsed the proposed conservation plan bylaw and the conservation plan. And on December 20th, 2017, Council passed bylaw 2017-138 to designate the cultural heritage landscape on the Glen Abbey property under Part 4, Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Whoa. Oh, there we go. Open houses were held in the afternoon and the evening on January 10th, 2018. Approximately 50 people over the 2 sessions attended. Presentations on the conservation plan and on the official plan and zoning bylaw amendments were given at both sessions. It's not liking me. There we go. The Cultural Heritage Landscape Conservation Plan for the Glen Abbey property, known as the Conservation Plan, is one of the measures undertaken by the town as part of Phase 3. The purpose of the Conservation Plan is to guide future alterations on Glen Abbey that are likely to affect the heritage attributes of the property, provide direction to ensure the conservation of Glen Abbey as a significant cultural heritage landscape is maintained. The Conservation Plan has a straightforward objective: retain cultural heritage value of Glen Abbey by guiding and directing future changes. The Conservation Plan is not a maintenance plan or an operations plan for the golf course. What it does is focuses conservation on the cultural heritage value or interest and the heritage attributes, organizes the landscape based on function, provides guidance on appropriate conservation measures, and supports decision-making. The Conservation Plan has several easy-to-use sections that help the town and property owner determine if heritage review is required, and if it is, what process needs to be followed. Actions fit into one of 3 categories. Category A actions do not require any heritage review. Category A actions include routine maintenance and provides clarity that the golf course can continue the daily operations such as mowing, fertilizing, and aerating. Category B alterations require staff review and consent. These are alterations that are likely to affect the heritage attributes on the property and may impact the cultural heritage value or interest of the property. Category B alterations include, for example, lengthening or shortening a hole. The staff review process is intended to be quick and simple with a projected 5-day turnaround for approvals. Category C alterations require council consent. These are alterations that are likely to affect the heritage attributes and are likely to impact the cultural heritage value or interest of the property. Category C alterations include, for example, additions or removals of holes. The council review process requires a review of the Heritage Oakville Advisory Committee. The process to council decision will generally take 45 to 90 days. The Conservation Plan has divided actions into categories that provide the process for review or no review. For the alteration that do require review, category B and C, the Conservation Plan provides an evaluation framework in the form of 2 checklists to determine if a proposed alteration is appropriate and conserves the cultural heritage value of the property. The first checklist is the Heritage Guidelines checklist. It addresses the 2 important questions. 1, is the guideline relevant to the proposed alteration? And 2, if relevant, is the proposed alteration consistent with the guideline? We're jumping around here. The second checklist, heritage value, links the heritage attributes back to the cultural heritage value of the property to ensure that the cultural heritage value of Glen Abbey is conserved. The Conservation Plan that is before Council this evening is a result of months of work from the Conservation Plan team. Consultation for the Conservation Plan has been ongoing since November, when the preliminary draft was provided to the property owner, Golf Canada, and focus group participants. Meetings were held to review this preliminary draft, and the feedback that was provided was used by the Conservation Plan team to revise the plan. In addition to formatting and readability, a number of minor revisions have been made as outlined in this evening's memo and can be summarized as follows. Minor corrections to typographical errors, completion of the decision-making tree in Schedule C, which presents the processes from Part 5 in a visual format. It's not so jumpy. It's almost done. Revisions to reflect staff's consideration of the January 22nd, 28th submission of the property owner's legal counsel, including clarification and addition of several actions to Schedules 4 and 5, revisions to the summary from the consultation, and revisions for consistency with clarification of Part 5. Staff is of the opinion that the changes made to the conservation plan from this December draft to the final conservation plan are important and are consistent with the intent of the December draft plan. These changes do not involve any substantial changes to the conservation plan before you. He gave me a dud. That ends my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Are there questions? Councillor Milgram.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, like, you've reviewed the additional information received, and you have made modifications then to accept some of the changes going forward?
Through your worship to Councillor Agart, yes, we've received all submissions that we had received, and in tonight's memo is attached an updated conservation plan.
Okay. And so that's taking all the feedback you have received and what you've figured is appropriate?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Madam Clerk, would you call the listed delegations?
Our first delegation speaking to this item is Fraser DeMoss.
Welcome, Mr. DeMoff. Council looks forward to your information.
I'd like to thank Mayor Burton and Council for allowing me to speak this evening. Tonight's another night where we're back again talking about Glen Abbey, and I think it's fitting that we focus at least part of our Save Glen Abbey delegation on the actual conservation plan itself. If you look at the Latin roots of conserve, you'll see it combines two elements: con, together, and servare, to keep. In noun form, conservation embodies the idea of preservation and protection of a valuable resource. Without a doubt, unless you work for ClubLink, Glen Abbey is one of Oakville's most valuable resources. It is the bedrock on which an entire community north of the QEW was built, an iconic landmark recognized by all of Canada as being synonymous with Oakville and certainly worthy of protection. The conservation plan for Glen Abbey before you tonight, in my opinion, strikes the right chord between balancing the protection of what makes Glen Abbey special with the operations that would be required in order for ClubLink to run one of Canada's most successful golf courses. Under this plan, Golf Canada could easily continue to host the Canadian Open at Glen Abbey as the permanent home for Canada's premier golf event. And throughout this process, we've heard from ClubLink that community members, heritage planning experts like Julian Smith, this mayor, this council, that we all have flawed thinking, that for some reason or another we don't understand the proper way things work, and that we are overstepping in the measures that we would be taking to try and protect this course. In ClubLink's own words in your packages tonight, you can see that they place no value in a conservation plan of this nature. But in the words of everyone here tonight, or most of us here tonight, including the almost 10,000 members of Save Glen Abbey Coalition, I'm here to say that we do see incredible value in this plan. We think it accurately and appropriately protects the heritage attributes of this historic property that make Glen Abbey so great. And this council and this mayor specifically have the full support of the Oakville community for the approval of the conservation plan for Glen Abbey Golf Course. Thank you.
Thank you for your information, Mr. DeMoff. Are there questions? Thank you, sir. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Next listed delegation is Mark Steinman.
Welcome, Mr. Steinman. Council looks forward to your information.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, councillors, city staff, and the audience of interested parties in what's going on with Glen Abbey. First, I would like to say that as a real estate professional practicing in the West GTA, I'm constantly reminded that Oakville is a preferred residence for living, working, and playing. We're very lucky to live in the jewel of the community of the GTA. An important aspect of the town's heritage is the history of being cottage country community with a large green canopy of trees and open spaces. Oakville has built a very strong brand and must continue to live up to this standard to ensure the town resonates as a beacon for families, businesses, and recreation. The key to Oakville's success is to protect the balance between development and conservation of heritage properties as it helps define us. The lands of Glen Abbey have much historical significance. It's approximately 229-acre green space in the middle of Oakville, home to over 1,000 trees, abundance of wildlife, and the 16-Mile Creek, which is Halton Region's major watershed. It was inhabited by Aboriginal peoples, a lumber mill, an estate property, a Jesuit retreat, and it's also the heart of an established planned community built around 1984 named Glen Abbey. And the golf operation has become one of the key courses of the worldwide golfing community, having hosted the Canadian Open 30 times at the last 41 years. And that, in my view, is by far the most notable course in the land. Furthermore, I can assure you that 99.9% of all the conversations I've had with people from Oakville, from the GTA, Sudbury, Barrie, Hamilton, Vancouver, New York, and even while traveling in Europe, all, except for 3 people, agree that the golf course is a green space and a key component of Oakville's worldwide brand. Oakville Town Council, Halton Region, and the province have aligned and approved the Livable Oakville Plan as it was created with great care and diligence by the town staff, who, by the way, did and continues to do an exemplary job in successfully managing to achieve the balance between pressures for growth while fortifying quality neighborhood corridors residents can enjoy. In fact, back in 2017, a team of experts concluded that the Glen Abbey property met all 9 criteria set by the province for municipal heritage protection. Meeting one criterion alone is considered sufficient for designation, so there's no doubt of its qualifications. So with clear conscience and on behalf of the several hundreds of supporters I have personally spoken to, and the many thousands from across Oakville who've signed the petition to save Glen Abbey, I wholeheartedly support the town in designating Glen Abbey as a cultural heritage landscape for conservation. Good planning is key to a stable future, and I applaud the mayor and town councillors for their overwhelming support of preserving Glen Abbey. We can only hope that the common sense will prevail beyond this point to continue the protection of this very special parcel of land for generations to come, as it helps define the town, the region, the province, and the people, all those who act as stewards for the future to ensure the rights and wishes of the people of Oakville are heeded and we remain a community conducive for protecting properties of significance.
Thank you for your information, Mr. Steinman. On the matter that's before us, the conservation plan itself, did you want to indicate whether you supported that or not?
Sure, thank you. I wholeheartedly support it.
Okay, thank you for that. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
The next listed delegation, and I apologize if I get this name incorrect, Ed Caravaggio.
Mr. Caravaggio, are you the famous artist?
I wish.
Welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
I'm certainly not profiting from any of his works. Your Worship, Mayor Burton and councillors, I'm here representing the National Golf Course Owners Association tonight as a board member, and to clarify our position on and emphasize on the conservation plan and the designation. I will read to you a letter that was submitted to council by our CEO, Mr. Jeff Calderwood. Dear Mayor, Burton and councillors as CEO of the National Golf Course Owners Association Canada, which represents the interests of 2,300 golf course owners and operators across Canada, including 820 in Ontario. I am writing with respect to the town's draft cultural heritage conservation plan for the Glen Abbey Golf Club property. During the week of November 20th, 2017, I was contacted by Mr. Angus Affleck, who I understand has been retained by the town as one of the consultants who is preparing the conservation plan. Mr. Affleck advised that he was contacting me given that the NGCOA Canada was one of the stakeholders identified by the town as having a potential interest in the conservation plan. As a result, I directed Mr. Affleck to contact myself, Edge Caravaggio, who is a board member in Toronto. I understand that Mr. Caravaggio was then provided with a copy of an initial draft of the conservation plan and asked to attend a meeting at the town offices on Monday, November 27th, 2017. That was 3 days later. I have spoken with Mr. Caravaggio, and I am told also in attendance at the meeting on November 27th were town staff, town consultants, certain members of the Heritage Oakville Advisory Committee, and the superintendent of the Lakeview Golf Course in Mississauga. It was not our understanding that the purpose of the meeting was, one, to receive detailed comments from our association on the draft conservation plan at that initial meeting, particularly given that Mr. Caravaggio only received the copy of the rather extensive document late in the afternoon, Friday, November 24th, for a meeting the following Monday morning. We did expect a follow-up consultation, though, to be prior to the town's release on the revised draft conservation plan. However, that did not happen. Having said that, I'm advised that Mr. Caravaggio informed town staff and the consultants at the meeting of the need for the golf course owners, and particularly those that host major tournaments, to have the certainty of being able to make necessary alterations to the golf course without delay, and that the golf course owners should therefore be able to operate with minimum oversight from municipal authorities. Mr. Caravaggio also questioned the appropriateness of some of the town's proposed heritage attributes for Glen Abbey property, but was told that this was not the purpose of the meeting and consequently would not be discussed. We noted that in subsequent report from the town's planning service department regarding the conservation plan dated December 6, 2017, there is reference to the meeting that Mr. Caravaggio attended on the 27th of November, referring to it as a focus group, in absence of any reference to the association's initial feedback in that meeting and any subsequent opportunity to meet for more detailed insight as we had intended. We are very concerned that the staff report implies that the NGCOA Canada is supportive of the conservation plan. That is certainly not the case. So it is important that we make it clear that our willingness to attend the meeting at the town's request must not be characterized or interpreted in any way as to support the conservation plan or the heritage designation of Glen Abbey Golf Club property itself. On the contrary, as you're aware, the National Golf Course Owners Association Canada submitted a letter to Town Council dated August 18, 2017, regarding the then proposed notice of intention to designate the Glen Abbey property under the Ontario Heritage Act. I think you have a copy of that letter, including the, at the same time, we noted that in response to concerns identified by Club Link Golf Canada regarding the proposed heritage designation for Glen Abbey, town staff had identified the use of a management plan that could include a list of changes to the golf course that would be exempt from heritage permit application. We suggested that a management plan of this nature could be a useful tool to mitigate some of our concerns and should be prepared prior to the commencement of the heritage designation process. Regrettably, the town did not accept our recommendation and instead commenced and has since completed the heritage designation process for Glen Abbey before preparing a management plan. We understand that one component of the conservation plan is to identify changes to the golf course that would be exempt from the requirements of a heritage permit, and as noted above, this is a matter of general interest to our members and the association. However, it is clear that the draft conservation plan goes well beyond this component, and together with the town's subsequent draft cultural heritage landscape conservation plan bylaw, raises very significant concerns we have about how you would actively regulate and micromanage the operation of a golf course through the heritage designation process. These concerns are not only legitimate with respect to the fair application to Glen Abbey, but more broadly as a serious precedent that negatively impacts other property owners, including golf courses throughout Canada. So the National Golf Course Owners Association Canada respectfully urges the town to reverse its intended course of action and requests that our concerns are accurately reflected in any staff report or other town documents that reference our association in relation to the town's proposed conservation plan and or heritage designation of Glen Abbey Golf Club property. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carvaccio. Appreciate your time. Madam Clerk?
The last listed delegation is Mark Flowers.
Mr. Flowers, welcome. Council looks forward to your information on this item as well.
Thank you once again, Mayor Burton and members of council. On this item, we also filed a written submission. In this case, we filed that a week ago yesterday, so town staff has obviously had time to review that. I see when I arrived this evening that in fact there's a memo that indicates they have reviewed that submission and made some very minor, a handful of changes as a result and in response to that. To clarify that the comments in our written submission were in response to the December version of the draft conservation plan. Last week, the town released a further updated version, and as I just mentioned, of course, there's been some subsequent changes to that. According to the staff report, and what I heard this evening from staff was that the latest revisions truly are, in their view, minor, have not changed the substance of the plan from what it was in December. So I think based on that, it's probably safe to say that the comments we made in our written submission equally apply, perhaps with the exception of some different section references to the document now in front of you being recommended by staff for approval. In any event, it's fair to say that our comments on the conservation plan go well beyond minor wording changes or the way in which the document happens to be organized. Our concerns with the document are of much more fundamental nature. First, although it's called a conservation plan, it is not actually a conservation plan as that term is normally understood in heritage planning practice. Both that's my own experience, I've also confirmed that with our heritage consultants. In our experience, a conservation plan is typically prepared by the owner of a heritage property, either in support of a development application for the property, or even imposed sometimes by the municipality as a condition of approval. And it typically identifies the measures that are to be taken by the owner then to conserve the site's cultural heritage values. And that doesn't mean that the heritage resource, in fact, is even going to be retained in its existing form. Conservation plans have been used where significant alterations to heritage attributes are being undertaken and may even involve full or partial demolition or removal of heritage structures. In fact, the most recent example I have in experience with conservation plans is in fact just that. It's a property where the existing heritage building is being demolished in its entirety and the municipality required a conservation plan, and that was prepared. The staff report here suggests that the document before you arises out of concerns raised by ClubLink, as well as the town's commitment to provide a guidance document identifying how the cultural heritage landscape that's been identified by the town could be preserved without unduly interfering with the management and operation of the existing golf course. And I think the implication from that statement made by staff is that ClubLink requested this conservation plan. So I want to be clear. ClubLink did not request the town prepare this document. We don't support the document as it's been prepared. This is a town-initiated exercise that is being taken without the owner's consent and indeed is proceeding despite the owner's repeated and consistent objections. We attended an initial meeting with town staff and its consultants on October 31st, 2017, before the first draft of the plan was prepared. And at that meeting, I asked about the status of the proposed plan, or sorry, what status it would have if it was ultimately approved, how it would be used in relation to the ongoing operations of the golf course. And I asked this in order to understand its potential implications for my client, ClubLink. The response I got was that my question was a good one, but unfortunately the town did not know the answer, or at least it wasn't prepared to answer the question at that time. And frankly, that response came as a bit of a surprise, given that the town had, at that point, already retained a team of consultants to prepare this plan, and it struck me as odd that they would do that without even knowing how that plan might be used once it was prepared and complete. With the subsequent release of the town's Cultural Heritage Conservation Bylaw that you just enacted a few moments ago, we know now what the implications could be, and needless to say, they're not favorable for many of the reasons I gave earlier when commenting on the bylaw. In terms of the plan itself, one of the most fundamental problems we have with the plan is the way in which it attempts to categorize these various actions that may occur at Glen Abbey into one of three categories: A, B, or C, with category A actions, as you heard, being exempt from heritage review, categories B and C being subject to town approval, either by staff or council. Contrary to the town's plan, the basis for determining whether town approval is required for any particular action at Glen Abbey is Section 33 of the Heritage Act, which stipulates that written consent of the town is required for any alteration that is likely to affect the property's heritage attributes. And the corollary of that, of course, is that if any action or alteration is not likely to affect the property's heritage attributes, there is no need for town approval. That determination can be made, at least at first instance, by the owner, and it can be made without any requirement for confirmation by the town. So in other words, the owner doesn't have to come to the town and get its blessing to ensure that it's not an action that would require town approval. The Act speaks to whether or not an approval is required. Further, if the action or alteration is not likely to affect the property's heritage attributes, there's no need by the owner to notify the municipality either before or after the alteration takes place. And by contrast to all of that, the proposed conservation plan before you has it all backwards. First of all, the plan proposes to make the determination of whether or not the heritage approval is required at this stage in the process. At this stage, without knowing the specifics of any particular action that might be contemplated in the future. Second, it suggests that if the proposed activity is not on any of the town's schedules, categories A, B, or C, prior notice to the town staff is required. I think that's what it says. Section 3.2 is where it says this. Prior notice to town staff is required, and town staff will then review the proposal to determine the appropriate category. Again, that's contrary to the Heritage Act. Third, it fails to acknowledge that the list of so-called Category A actions are by definition, and they have to be, non-exhaustive. It's not possible to identify at this point every single action or alteration at Glen Abbey that could occur that would not likely affect the property's heritage attributes. One can create a list. Obviously, the town has done that. We have done that. But it's not an exhaustive list, and it can't be an exhaustive list. The authors of the plan have identified 63 exempt actions. Again, at least that was the previous version. I must admit I didn't just check whether that number's changed. But that was the number that they had identified. But again, that by no means is the full extent of the actions that would not trigger heritage review. In response to the town's draft plan, we asked Glen Abbey's superintendent to review the town's list against his annual maintenance program. He identified over 100 additional items. And again, that's not intended to be the full list, but certainly adds to the town's list. But again, it's important to realize, Council, that not all of these actions are exempt from heritage review simply because the town says so, or because the town has put it on a list. They're exempt because Section 33 of the Heritage Act does not apply. ClubLink has also noted a number of activities that it carries out at the property that require approvals from other public agencies, whether it be regional, provincial, or federal levels of government. These approvals should not then be subject to a further heritage review by the town. And further, just because town staff has identified a potential action, again, at this stage in the process as a Category B or C action, and claims that it is therefore subject to a town approval, does not make it so. Again, that determination is based on whether it meets the test under Section 33 of the Heritage Act, whether the alteration is likely to affect the heritage attributes. I would also note there are inconsistencies in the town's list. Some actions appear to be included both on Category A and Category B. Again, that creates a lot of uncertainty for the owner. Category A says they're exempt. Category B says you got to make an application. And I'll just give you an example. It was 41, I see it's now item 40 of Category A, includes resurfacing of parking lots. So resurfacing of parking lots is on the list of category actions, which means that's exempt from approval. But if you turn to Category B, which is now the one subject to town approval, item 1 includes any changes to parking lots, which presumably would include resurfacing. So again, is it a Category A? Is it a Category B? And that's just one example. If we then turn to Category C actions, again, these are the ones that would have to come before council according to the plan. We note that, again, there is reference to the removal, that's the term that's used, removal of buildings and structures. As I noted previously in my submissions, a demolition or removal of a building or structure is dealt with separately from an alteration in the Heritage Act. The former is subject to Section 34 for demolition removal. The latter, being alteration, is subject to Section 33. And this is problematic because this particular document says this is dealing with alterations under Section 33, not dealing with Section 34. As a result of all of these problems with the document, we urge council to reject the staff recommendation and not approve the plan. Having said that, we have noted in our written submission that ClubLink does see some value in having a list of actions that both ClubLink and the town mutually agree would not trigger any need for heritage review and approval by the town, recognizing, of course, that's still a non-exhaustive list. And such a list would not need to be, however, in a conservation plan. It can be a standalone document, essentially, that the town and ClubLink create mutually. If council wishes to cooperate with ClubLink in this regard, we would ask council then to direct staff to work with ClubLink to compile such a list, recognizing we've already started that exercise with the town's initial list, together with, in Category A, together with the additional items we've identified in our submission. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Flowers, for your information. Are there questions for the gentleman? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Council, I have a question for staff on this submission. Are we, have we, ClubLink's list of 100 items?
Yes, we do, Mr. Mayor. That was included in their January 22nd submission that is actually submitted to you tonight in terms of the package the clerk had given you. It's also attached to the staff report that was in front of you.
Okay, so in other words, you've given full consideration to this information?
Yes, we have, and that was the reason why the memo is provided here. We did see some advantages in providing some clarity, and so we have recommended some changes as a result of the letter that we received.
Great. I hope that that helps the public understand the submissions. Councillor O'Meara.
Thank you, Worship. Sorry, and just as a follow-up, I guess if new issues come up and new maintenance schedules come up, what's the process to decide how those are going to factor into which schedule, or how do we go about deciding, is that an A, B, or C? I mean, obviously it's impossible to get everything, but how does that process look? What does that process look like moving forward?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, there are opportunities to amend the plan if we find, as we're implementing the plan, there are new things that we should be taking into consideration. That opportunity still exists.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, do you have more listed delegations? Are there members of the public with information for council on this matter? Yes, sir. Would you like to come to the public podium and share your information? I might ask you to identify yourself as well.
My name is Jonathan Colligan. I'm a resident of Oakville. I have no prepared remarks for this evening, just more comments on what I've heard over the course of the evening. From what I've heard and from following this since the inception, obviously an issue from ClubLink has been the the official plan amendments and bylaws that infringe on their ability to make changes to the golf course, and that they've stated that in some instances the measures that have been taken are overreaching. But what I would like to bring to the attention of council is how many actual major changes have occurred to the layout of Glen Abbey since the acquisition by ClubLink in 1999, whether there have been major modifications, and if there is some type of golf course redesign in the works, because it seems from what the staff report indicates is that the town seems to be willing to work with ClubLink on any issues that arise on the operation of the golf course. And from what I've seen, it almost, from what the developer states, is they over-exaggerate the impact of these changes and the conservation measures that the town wishes to put into place. And then it appears as though their opposal to these bylaws rests solely on the fact that it hinders their ability to demolish the golf course and not on the operations of the golf course itself. Thank you.
Thank you for your observations. All right, anyone else? Yes, ma'am. Ms. Baker, welcome back to the microphone. Council looks forward to your new information.
Thank you, and uncharacteristically, I'll be very brief in this delegation. In having reviewed the conservation plan, we share the opinion of the experts that the proposed cultural heritage landscape plan conserves the cultural values of the Glen Abbey property. And we also support its objective of providing a clear and efficient process to assess proposed alterations and to ensure that proposed alterations meet applicable heritage requirements. But more so, we appreciate the cultural heritage plan for its ability to ensure certainty in the process going forward. That's very important for my clients, many of whom abut the golf course itself. It's submitted that the conservation plan ameliorates the concern raised by Mr. Flowers when I was here back at the time the designating bylaw was going forward, which was to have a plan to ensure that the golf course could continue under the designating bylaw. And I submit that this conservation plan, contrary to Mr. Flowers' submission, is very helpful because Section 33 under the Ontario Heritage Act is very broad and in fact could require approval by council that under this plan are either exempt or would otherwise be delegated to staff. And I would comment with respect to the reference to the parking lots being a source of confusion under the two different categories. I think the reasonable person test would understand that when something is exempt under category A, it is not otherwise caught under category B. So I don't believe that that confusion actually exists. And for those reasons, Mr. Mayor and members of council, my client requests that you support staff recommendation in this regard.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Questions for Ms. Baker? Thank you, Ms. Baker. Anyone else? All right, I'm going to confine it to table, and I'm going to come back to Councillor Elgar. We've done a circuit around the town, so to speak.
Thank you very much,
Councillor Elgar.
Mayor Burton. Based on the staff feedback on reviewing the application and all the information, and also looking at the January 22nd letter, I would move the staff recommendation with the minor revisions that we have before us tonight, dated January the 30th, which are minor in nature. So I would ask that we pass the recommendation that is written with the minor revisions, and I would ask for a recorded vote. Thank you.
Thank you. We will have a recorded vote. Are there any speakers to the motion? May I have a word? The work on tonight's agenda has been underway for our town since 2009. That's when we unanimously adopted our Livable Oakville official plan. We involved our community in what was an intensive and extensive 2-year process of public consultation. The night that we adopted the Livable Oakville plan, one residents association leader said, "It feels so good to live in a town where the council listens to the people." That remark has motivated councils in Oakville ever since to keep our focus on the public interest in our decisions. After the province ordered changes to our official plan and gave its official approval, we began implementation of the Livable Oakville official plan. The Livable Oakville official plan has far-sighted policies and directions. One was to identify and conserve Oakville's cultural heritage landscapes. To fulfill that direction, staff have completed 3 key studies with strong public input: a town-wide urban structure review, a cultural heritage landscape study, and a land use and economic impact analysis. Our residents' associations have continued to follow closely all amendments to the plan and its related zoning bylaws to ensure that the key planning principles of our community-driven official plan are maintained. Conserving the heritage assets of our community is a fundamental concern for our residents and their associations. Our residents' associations have been working with us over the past 10 years on the development of the town's cultural heritage strategy, and over the past 2 years on the study of potential cultural heritage landscapes across our community. Last year, they all spoke in support of Council's decision to declare Glen Abbey Golf Course property a cultural heritage landscape after the assessment was completed. Our residents and we on Council, we recognize that equally important to tonight's discussion is how these proposed amendments align with provincial policies and growth plans. Our 2009 Livable Oakville official plan picked up its cultural heritage landscape direction and policies from the province's 2005 provincial policy statement, which is supposed to guide municipalities in writing their official plans, among other things. Our residents all over town have told me they are pleased to see a conservation plan that is simple and would permit the golf course to continue to host the Canadian Open and conserves the important heritage value of the property. For these reasons, our community leaders have told me they support the conservation plan and bylaws necessary to conserve what is, after all, the most significant cultural heritage landscape of Oakville. We've heard from the public and the other stakeholders. Staff had made adjustments in response to the submissions. Now it is our role as members of Oakville Town Council to make our decision on the final one of these proposals before us, and I thought I would make these remarks at the end of the 4, but they really apply to all of them. So to be recorded in favor of the motion, please rise to be named. Councillor Adams, Councillor Grant, Councillor Knoll, Councillor Elgar, Mayor Burton, Councillor Hutchins, Councillor Giddings, Councillor Chisholm, Councillor Robinson, Councillor O'Meara. I declare the measure carried. Now, I'm looking to a member of council for a motion to rise and report to council. Councillor Grant, thank you. All in favor? That carries. I rise and report the Committee of the Whole has met and made recommendations on public hearing item 1, discussion items 2, 3, and 4, as noted by the clerk. May I have a mover and seconder for the report? Councillor Chisholm and Councillor Giddings. All those in favor? The report is adopted. Council, we now need a mover and seconder for consideration of our bylaws, and I'm just going to read the list off. I'll take the movers first. Councillor Hutchins, Councillor Knoll, 2018-15, 2018-16 as revised, 2018-19, 2018-20, and 2018-21, the bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the meeting of council. All those in favor of the bylaws? And the bylaws are adopted. That completes our agenda. It's been great working with you. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and we are adjourned.